Good afternoon to you. Mark Stott with HurricaneTrack.com here. Time for the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion. It is Monday, October 10th, 2022. Luckily, this Monday, or this October 10th, 4 years ago, that was on a Wednesday, far different than what we were looking at 4 years ago when Category 5 Hurricane Michael slammed into portions of the Florida Panhandle. Definitely, I think, our project's biggest triumph in terms of capturing those impacts from multiple camera angles as well as collecting meteorological data. A very big benchmark moment in our project's history already 4 years ago. So I'm going to talk about that in the last about 2/3 of our update today, and a little bit of a comparison between Michael and Ian. Ian is still so fresh, it's going to take a while for us to really unpack exactly all the mechanics of what happened with Ian, and then eventually it'll become more of a historic event, and we can look back at Ian and understand its impacts even better, kind of like we're doing here with Michael. All right, but first, tropics. We do have some interesting things going on out there. This is not associated directly with Julia. Julia is down here in the eastern Pacific at Guatemala, El Salvador border area. But let's go back to the Atlantic. What is this? Well, this is a trough, little surface trough of low pressure down there, producing disorganized showers and thunderstorms. There is some chance of development as it moves over here. Let's just look at that on the 5-day version. As it moves into the Bay of Campeche, 20% chance of development. And if it does get a name, if, it would be Carl, not Julia again. It's part of an overall large area of energy loosely associated with Julia. But Julia itself is still down here, like I said, in the eastern Pacific realm or basin, whatever you want to call it. El Salvador, Guatemala down there, that's where the center of circulation is, and that feature could move on out into the Pacific here over the open water and develop a little bit more. They give it about a 30% chance of development, they being the National Hurricane Center. So we'll watch and see how these two areas that are kind of related, and look, you can see that here nicely on the satellite. Let's just go to that. There's our surface trough kind of stuck in here. This is the leftover energy from Julia down here. Related but unrelated, distant cousins, whatever you want to call it. Bottom line is this piece of energy could wind up over here and try to develop some in the Bay of Campeche. And then what's left over of Julia kind of winds up over here in the eastern Pacific. The rest of the Caribbean, Southwest Atlantic, and the Gulf are nice and quiet. Strong upper level winds that will be cutting through this way should prevent whatever might happen with that one system there that's outlined by the Hurricane Center from doing too much. And we can see this on the vorticity signature pretty nicely here. There's a piece of energy there. That's the one the Hurricane Center has outlined. The energy from Julia is down here. So overall, a large area of generally disturbed weather. Again, one will kind of try to break off and move up towards the Bay of Campeche. The other down here off the coast of Mexico. Kind of complicated, but there you have it. All right, so what's happening out there in terms of where we are, where we might be headed, so forth and so on? Well, we're pretty much going to conclude the first third of October, roughly, if you divide it up into 3 10-day segments, plus the last day there being October 31st. It's 3 sets of thirds plus 1, whatever you call that. But yes, we're going through the first third now. It's done, out of the way after today. That's a good way to look at it. So we have 2/3 of the month left. And typically, after about the 10th to the 12th of October, we really see a climatological decrease in the occurrence of tropical cyclone activity. That being said, the areas that we really watch are generally speaking right through here, just roughly outlining it. And, you know, something could still pop up through the rest of the month, especially if the Madden-Julian oscillation becomes favorable and established in the Western Hemisphere. That might happen. We'll take a look at that more tomorrow and maybe Wednesday. And otherwise, water temperatures are still generally warm enough everywhere except right along the shelf areas of the lower 48. Almost everywhere now it's just a little bit too cool to keep an intense hurricane coming in at peak intensity. But that's only part of the story. You can still get major surge, major wind, and major rain impacts even from a system that is entering an area where the water temperatures have cooled off. And here's a great case in point. All right, so the 26 degrees Celsius isotherm, line of equal temperature, 26 Celsius, let's just call it 80 Fahrenheit. That's right through here. So generally speaking, it has pulled just south of most of the Gulf Coast areas, especially Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and most of Florida. Southwest Florida still right there close to it, about 80 degrees. If you would want to venture into those waters, they're kind of filled with yucky stuff draining back off the landmass, so I wouldn't want to go out there. But if you're venturing out, water temperatures south of Charlotte Harbor here and the Caloosahatchee, etc., yes, they're still right at about 80 degrees. So if a big, gigantic, if a hurricane were to come through the Yucatan Channel and cut across, there would be sufficient warm water here for it to maintain intensity if it did it this week. But a strong cold front is coming. I saw Brian McNulty talking about that on Twitter earlier today. It should sweep through Florida. So time is running out for major impacts. Now, Wilma in 2005 was late October, and you can't rule it out completely that somebody along the Gulf Coast from Florida all the way around to Texas, it's a non-zero chance. It's getting less and less overall. I mean, we're getting close to zero. It have to be fast-moving, pretty large, that kind of thing. And the other good news is we don't see anything coming up in the guidance over the next week or so. So we're just about there. I talked about this a little bit last week. Definitely trying to provide some good news out there with all the anxiety I'm sure that still remains, especially in Florida. We're getting close. We're getting close here. Every day it gets a little closer overall. Water temperatures definitely on the way down, which is expected this time of year, and we're almost there. Now for the Atlantic, it's a little different story. The water temperatures here have pulled away generally from the coastal areas in terms of the warmest, starting to get a decent gradient set up here. The difference in temperature over distance, that's what we call a temperature gradient. But the Gulf Stream and just the generally warm western Atlantic still prevalent. So a fast-moving system coming out of the Caribbean, a la Hazel 1954, something similar to Sandy 10 years ago that wound up off the coast and then pinwheeled back in. Those are still possible scenarios, or your hybrid systems that get formed off of Hatteras here and maybe mill around and then they head out into the Atlantic, those sort of subtropical, nor'easter, extratropical, mid-latitude cyclones, whatever you want to call them, those are just labels. There's still enough warm water to support some big events, something like that, and that's where the vulnerable Outer Banks, areas along the Chesapeake that got hammered with the ghost of Ian. We're not done yet, but it is getting closer. Kind of that balance between giving the all clear versus, we're not trying to make stuff up. We don't do that here. But it is looking pretty good going forward. All right? And we can see that, too, in the Euro from Tropical Tidbits. This is the 12Z from today, Zulu time, meaning that it was initialized at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. And if it was 18Z, that would be 2 p.m. Eastern Time, just to give you an idea of what that Z means. ECMWF, that's the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and it is about 5,000 feet in the atmosphere. That's what 850 millibars represents. And we're looking for this down here, the energy, the cyclonic vorticity, some spin. Does it bundle? Is it linear and stretched out like this, or just kind of amorphous like that? That's what we look for. Just in case you're brand new to my videos today, this is the area, this is the fingerprint. That's what we're trying to discern. Does that develop into anything? Let's look out. This goes in 24-hour increments here. Now, the Euro is interesting. It tries to take that piece of energy here, and it does try to get it going just a little bit, concentrating it in the extreme southern Bay of Campeche, while the true remnants of Julia are down here. So 48 hours into the future, a little bit more of a concentrated area there in the southwest Bay of Campeche, finally by 72. The argument could be made that maybe we get a depression, maybe a named storm. We'll just have to wait and see. Doesn't look very strong, that's for sure. And then it gets sheared and kind of buried back down. And by the way, there's the signs, the long stretched out vorticity of that cold front that comes in and then it comes through and clears Florida. And then there's nice high pressure building in behind, dry continental air, and the winds switching around, mixing the Gulf up, closing the door even more so, almost all the way to the 2022 hurricane season. Good riddance, I'm sure a lot of people thinking that. And by day 5, whatever does try to develop, long gone, buried down there. Strong surface and mid-level high pressure develops over the southeast U.S. A nice fall day coming up Saturday, a few days out. The weekend will be very lovely, good football weather, as they say, not good hurricane weather. Now, 4 years ago, it was quote-unquote good hurricane weather, so to speak, in the sense that we had Michael. It was a very favorable setup. Getting into the synoptics of it, that's not necessarily the purpose of this discussion. Looking back 4 years, it was just that little window there. It was a depression, a storm, just a few days before landfall. A lot was made from even some very prominent meteorologists that this would just be a late season, sheared, east-weighted system where it kind of looks like a comma. 70 knots, maybe. Even the National Hurricane Center's first advisory showed, I do believe it was a Category 1. That's the intensity. They did have it making landfall pretty much right there. The timing was right. The location was right 5 days out. Wow, does that sound familiar? That was the exact same thing that happened with Ian. The first forecast was for it to go into southwest Florida, south of Tampa. It was later that the tracks shifted, and we all remember that. But that's a different area of coastline, and this is one of those lessons here. You're talking about geometry with angles of attack and the way the coastline is shaped. And here along the panhandle of Florida, from the Cape over here, up towards Panama City Beach, and west of there towards Miramar, somewhat concave shape. Yes, so it catches that water, but it's not as pronounced as what we saw with Fort Myers Beach, between Bonita Springs, Bonita Beach, and areas like Naples, Collier County, and into Lee County. That's a much more pronounced concave area, and that's something we'll talk about later. But the setup for Michael was perfect for about 2 days, the 8th, 9th, and 10th. So really, the 9th into the 10th, that 24-hour period, remarkably favorable, with the interaction with the trough helping to evacuate that air instead of shearing it. Very similar to Ian, and Michael tightened up, had a well-defined eye wall, just missing a fairly major population area. Panama City, it's not small potatoes there, it's not Fort Myers in terms of population, but that was a close call for a big population area as it was. The center went over Tyndall Air Force Base. Mexico Beach was in the right front quadrant, never getting into the eye itself. In Mexico Beach, you can see right there. And we left, my partner and I, Brent, Panama City area, about 2 hours, maybe 3 hours at best before landfall. Drove out to Mexico Beach where we had a live camera set up already. Our live camera system, we used the Nest cams. That was the first year that we were using the Nest cams. We had used Logitech cameras before that through Ustream. Then we switched over to Nest and their system and routing it to YouTube a little bit in 2018. And this is what it kind of looks like here. I'll scroll through a little bit. This is literally us. This is our little documentary. Well, it's a long documentary. It's 5 hours, 58 minutes if you want to watch it. And you can certainly scroll through, of course. But this is us leaving the Hampton Inn in Panama City. And we get on out there. It took about 30 minutes or so. There's Highway 98 before Michael. It's all leveled and cleared out. Now it's a totally different scene out there. We arrive in Mexico Beach. These are the last images ever taken of an intact Mexico Beach. And the similarities here to Ian for us are just striking. We drove to Sanibel Island and Captiva Tuesday evening before Ian's landfall to put a live cam out there. Did not put a GoPro on Captiva. We probably should have. I was relying more on the network in Southwest Florida, whereas here I was pretty concerned that we would lose that live cam. Plus I had some good intelligence coming in from the National Hurricane Center that Mexico Beach would in fact be ground zero for that massive violent surge from Michael, and that's exactly what happened. And if we fast forward here, we see that we get there and we start to set up that camera. This is our old Chevy Tahoe. Not the one that we use with 400,000 miles on it. This is a different one. that one of our partners had donated to the project. Our good friend Kerry, may he rest in peace. He died in early 2020. That's that old Tahoe, the other one that we had. It's almost a duplicate. Anyway, we got out, we set that camera box up, and of course you might remember this is what it looked like. I put a timestamp on it from here forward. We're getting ready to take off. We get out of there after fastening it up, and Brent's checking, I'm checking just to make sure, is it working? Trying to see that little red light. It's one of these guys right here, a Hero 4, and we wanted to see if it's still recording. Very, very important to know. And Brent checks, and then the rest, as they say, is history. By 10 o'clock, we're back in Panama City, and we fast forward here later on in the morning, 10:30, going on out into time, 10:54, and finally 11:30ish. The winds are really starting to pick up. Pieces of buildings, siding coming off, strong downburst of wind, very similar to what we would have seen at Fort Myers Beach, for example, in that right front quadrant of Ian, where Max Olson had a camera very similar to a GoPro. And if you hadn't seen that Max Olson footage, I mean, I'm sure you have by now, that is remarkable. Him working on what we have done over the years, and a good collaboration too. There is no competition. It's wonderful what he did in Fort Myers Beach in a same kind of setup, that right front quadrant there. But the difference is the footage here from Michael is a lot more violent overall. The wind is way stronger. The surge comes in later as the surge in Fort Myers Beach from Max's video. It's a gradual process, much higher overall, probably, we'll wait for the surveys, but 10 to 15 feet easily, whereas the actual water rise right here in Mexico Beach, where we were with this camera, was only 3 or 4 feet, but the water had to come up about 13 feet to get there. And so the velocity was much stronger in Mexico Beach than what we saw in Max's footage, owing to the fact of the core structure between the two. Very interesting, and eventually I will have Max's footage and we're going to compare the two. But looking back, two very damaging hurricanes for the state of Florida, 4 years apart, roughly, almost 4 years apart. And then as the day goes on, the remnants there, what's left of a very battered Mexico Beach. But it wasn't just Mexico Beach. Had a camera down here in East Point. This is our GoPro. East Point, Florida, a little bit farther to the east, over along the panhandle there. And as this short montage shows you, this is very similar to what Max did with his footage that's on social media. Very, very popular footage showing what happened with Ian. This is East Point, far removed from the core of Michael. And it just shows you that area of surge was pretty far and wide. It actually extended all the way over to St. Mark's up in the Appalachee Bay. And this is East Point GoPro footage from Michael. That surge came in. I'll try to fast forward through it just a little bit for you here. Yep, 3 to 4, maybe 5 feet of water rise there in Michael. I don't remember how far away that was, maybe 40, 50 miles from the core of Michael, if memory serves. And you can see pretty destructive, the wind waves, the wind acting on the water. That is what storm surge is, the wind pushing the water on shore. It's not one big tidal wave that comes in like you see in some of these Hollywood movies. Max's footage caught that perfection, to the way that works in Fort Myers Beach. This example 4 years ago in the panhandle of Florida also showing that it's a gradual process. And then throughout the day, it just kept coming up, and there was wind damage, of course. But water, I'm telling you, I think that is still our biggest enemy here. We can really build against the wind. People say, oh, my house is built for a Category 5 or whatever. It's very solid. People are going to come here to stay if there's a hurricane. It's so well built. Maybe that's true for the wind, but if the water comes up 10 to 15 feet, unless your house is airtight and you can look out those windows, and I'm not even trying to be funny here, but if you can look out the window and it's like you're inside of a goldfish bowl, but reversed, and you can see the water outside your window 15 feet up, oh, okay, well, that's fine. But I don't think houses are built to withstand that, and certainly not the bulldozing effect of those waves, as we saw from the video there from Mr. Olson down at the Fort Myers Beach area, tucked in right in here, that right front quadrant of Ian, just shoving the Gulf of Mexico in there. A very similar overall setup that Fort Myers Beach, and Sanibel down to Naples in Collier County in the right front quadrant of a very powerful hurricane, a well-developed core, very similar to Michael. Michael was just a little bit more intense, and it was still definitely strengthening at landfall. The pressure was plummeting, and Michael, it had just about leveled out and started to rise again with Ian, but you still had a tremendous surge owed to the fact that the shelf out here, the continental shelf, extends really far out, whereas on the Panhandle, it drops off quicker. So you had more energy that had to be put into the Gulf to get it on shore. Just an interesting compare and contrast a little bit here as we look back 4 years ago to really our benchmark moment in our project, I think, to date, and that was Hurricane Michael. Real quick, I will put a link in the description of today's video to that almost 6 hour, it's not a documentary so much as it is just raw, unedited footage, so to speak. It's like once we set up the GoPro, it just goes right on through. There's no transitions or dissolves. There's no music. I do documentaries where I put music, and that's the Tracking the Hurricanes 2018. I'll also put that in today's video if you want to see that as well. Learning from the past. It is very important. This video used that I just showed you in a lot of FEMA and Weather Service campaigns around the country. It's been on several television shows as well. Seeing is believing, and I hope the same will happen with the footage that Max Olson captured, as well as the other chasers that were down there. Severe Studios has cameras now. The more the better. There are also cameras like these right here. All the different people that filmed their own peril. That will get out and hopefully be a lesson that we can all look at. Not to go viral, not to be big on TikTok. That's not the point. This isn't Black Mirror, you know, and that would be a heck of an episode. You remember there was an episode where everybody just filmed everything. I don't remember what episode it was, a very creepy dystopian series on Netflix. This isn't that. This is real life, and I think too many people did film the water outside their window, their $1 million cars floating out, and in some cases, some people filmed, and then they didn't live afterwards. They sent messages to loved ones, and they didn't make it. And that is a very sad thing, because it is 100% preventable, especially we can look back and say, this is what hurricanes do. This is not augmented reality on television. This is not a computer animation like I've done in the past for some of my awareness work. These are real pictures. These are real experiences, and we have to learn from them, whether it's Michael 4 years ago, Ian now coming up on 2 weeks ago, or something as far back as just before I was born, and that would be like Camille, or midway between, roughly, I'm just trying to spitball it here, Katrina 05. We must learn. Ike in 08. I don't know. Sometimes I think we're doing well, and sometimes I think we might be taking some steps backwards. We need that number of deaths to be 0, and we can do that if we can appreciate what we're seeing here and respect the power of these storms. All right? All right, there's my op-ed piece for the day. That's it. Let me get this online for you. You know what? Let's end it on a good note. At least right now, 4 years later, nothing of the kind out there. And that's great news. We'll take all the great news we can get. I think we can all agree with that. All right. Thanks as always for tuning in. I do appreciate your time and attention. I am Mark Sudduth for Hurricane Track. I'll be back with more for you tomorrow.